For nearly a year, one of Edinburgh's most respected teachers of anatomy opened his dissecting room to a supply of corpses that arrived far too fresh, far too often, and always from the same two men. And the question that has followed him for almost 200 years is really this simple. Did Robert Knox know? In April of 1828, a young woman is carried through the doors of Knox's school on Surgeons Square. She's reportedly still warm when she arrives, her skin unmarked by the months underground that a stolen grave corpse would normally show. And instead of being wheeled straight to the dissecting table she's set aside, because Knox's people consider her too fine a specimen to waste on an ordinary lesson, her name was Mary Patterson, and rather than dissect her immediately, the school keeps her body for days, preserved to slow the decay, while artists are reportedly allowed in to sketch her. Still, according to every surviving account, nobody in that building asks the one question that should have been unavoidable. Where did this body come from? And why does it look like it died yesterday? Mary Patterson was only one of at least 16 murder victims who would eventually pass through Knox's school. And by the time the truth came out, the city of Edinburgh was left asking a question that has never been fully answered since. How much did the man buying these bodies actually know? And how much did he simply choose not to find out? To understand why nobody stopped this sooner, you have to understand what Edinburgh's medical schools were dealing with in the 1820s. The city was one of the great centres of medical training in Europe, and Robert Knox ran one of its most successful private anatomy schools, teaching by some accounts more than 500 students in a single academic year. And every one of those students needed a body to learn from. The trouble was that the law only allowed a handful of corpses a year for dissection, mostly executed criminals, which was nowhere near enough to keep pace with a booming medical profession. So a black market filled the gap, run by so-called resurrectionists, men who dug up freshly buried bodies at night and sold them on to anatomy schools that asked very few questions. By the time Burke and Hare arrived on the scene, buying an illegally sourced corpse wasn't unusual at all. It was simply how the system worked. That distinction matters, because stealing a body from a grave and murdering someone for their body are two very different crimes. And anatomists like Knox already operated inside a world where the first one was quietly tolerated. What nobody had accounted for was two men figuring out that you could skip the grave entirely. It didn't start as murder. Late in 1827, an elderly lodger in William Hare's boarding house died of natural causes while still owing rent, and Hare, together with William Burke, decided to recoup the debt by selling the body rather than burying it. They carried the corpse to Knox's school and walked away with somewhere between £7 and £8, which for two men living hand-to-mouth in Edinburgh's poorest quarter was an extraordinary amount of money for one night's work. That single transaction taught them something the rest of the city would come to regret. A fresh body was worth more than an Edinburgh labourer might otherwise earn in several months of ordinary work, and they didn't need to wait for someone to die of natural causes to get one. Early in 1828, Burke and Hare began killing, usually by getting a victim drunk and then suffocating them, pressing down on the chest while covering the nose and mouth, a method chosen specifically because it left almost no obvious mark on the body. According to Hare's own testimony, given in exchange for immunity from prosecution, he and Burke murdered at least 16 people this way over about 10 months and delivered every one of the bodies to the same buyer, Robert Knox's anatomy school. Historian Lisa Rosner, who has studied the case closely, points to a problem that's hard to get around. An experienced anatomist repeatedly receiving unusually fresh bodies over and over from the same two suppliers should eventually have started asking where they came from. One account attributed to Burke's own confession even claims Knox approved of a body specifically because it was so fresh, without asking a single question about how it got that way. None of that proves Knox knew people were being murdered for him, but it explains exactly why suspicion started building around him in the first place, and Mary Patterson's case was only the beginning. By the autumn of 1828, Burke and Hare had murdered James Wilson, a well-known figure around Edinburgh's streets, someone locals called Daft Jamie because of his learning difficulties, and someone practically the whole city would have recognized on sight. His body was delivered to Knox's school like all the others, and according to multiple accounts, students in the room realized immediately who was lying on the table. What happened next is where the story stops being about resurrectionists and starts being about the school itself. Accounts agree that students recognized him and that Knox denied it could be anyone they knew, even as the questions kept coming. Whatever exactly was said in that room, the pattern is hard to miss. This was no longer just a case of an anatomist failing to ask where a body came from. It was a case of him being told, apparently more than once, and choosing denial over an actual answer. By November of 1828, the killing finally caught up with them. Burke and Hare murdered a woman named Margaret Docherty. Other lodgers grew suspicious, the police were called, and her body was found inside Knox's own school. Burke and his partner Helen McDougall were put on trial that December. Burke was convicted, and Hare walked free after agreeing to testify against him. Burke was hanged on the 28th of January, 1829, in front of one of the largest crowds Edinburgh had ever gathered, and his own body was then publicly dissected, which is an irony that's hard to overstate. So what does the evidence against Knox actually look like, laid out plainly? The bodies arriving at his school were extraordinarily fresh. They kept coming from the same two men again and again for almost a year. Two of the victims were recognizable enough that people inside his own building apparently knew who they were looking at, and through all of it there's no record of Knox or his staff making any serious inquiry into where these bodies were actually coming from. Now weigh that against what's missing. There is no letter, no witness, no confession, nothing at all connecting Knox to ordering a murder or paying extra for one, and Burke himself, once convicted, specifically cleared Knox of knowing what he and Hare had done. Much of the actual buying was handled by Knox's assistants rather than Knox personally, and Burke and Hare reportedly had a plausible cover story ready, claiming the bodies came from poor lodging houses where nobody was left to claim them. Even doctors who examined Margaret Docherty's body specifically looking for signs of murder could only say suffocation was probable, not certain, which makes it considerably less surprising that Knox, an anatomist rather than a forensic examiner, didn't diagnose it from a corpse arriving for a routine dissection. Faced with public fury, Knox actually asked for an inquiry into his own conduct, and a committee was convened to investigate. Its conclusion, when it finally came in March of 1829, wasn't the clean acquittal his supporters wanted. The committee found no evidence that Knox or his assistants knew murder had been committed, but it also criticized his school directly for accepting bodies without asking nearly enough about where they came from. Even that process had its critics. Sir Walter Scott refused to join the committee at all, declaring in his own words that he wouldn't lend a hand to whitewash what he called this much to be suspected individual. Robert Christison, one of the two doctors who had examined Margaret Docherty's body for signs of murder and who later interviewed Knox directly as part of the investigation, came away from it with a harsh private judgment of the man, reportedly considering him, in his own words, deficient in principle and in heart. Strip away the myths and the popular retellings, and serious historians of the case tend to land in one of a few places. The most forgiving reading is that Knox genuinely believed he was buying into the existing illegal grave trade, that his assistants handled most of the actual transactions, and that a killing method built specifically to avoid leaving marks did exactly what it was designed to do. That's broadly what the 1829 committee itself concluded. The more troubling reading is negligence rather than knowledge, and it's arguably the interpretation the surviving pattern of evidence supports best. Knox likely didn't know at the very start, but as the bodies kept arriving unnaturally fresh, and especially after Patterson and Wilson, he had every reason to start asking questions and simply didn't, which doesn't make him a murderer, but does make him reckless in a way that had real consequences. And then there's the darkest reading, which is also the hardest to prove and, honestly, the most historically compelling, that at some point Knox suspected exactly what was happening and made a conscious choice never to ask the question out loud, because as long as nobody told him where the bodies came from, He could keep telling himself he didn't know. Knox was never put on trial for murder because there was never enough evidence to charge him with one. He lived out the rest of his career in disgrace, his effigy burned by Edinburgh crowds, remembered in a children's rhyme that put him right alongside the killers themselves. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy who buys the beef. William Burke's skeleton is still on display today in the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum, not far from where his own victims once ended up on Knox's dissecting table. We cannot prove Robert Knox knew Burke and Hare were murdering people for him. The surviving evidence simply doesn't take us that far. But by the time unusually fresh bodies were arriving again and again, and familiar faces were turning up on his own dissecting tables, perhaps knowing was no longer really the point. The real question was whether Knox had decided, somewhere along the way, that there were some answers he was better off never asking for. Because sometimes I didn't know, and I didn't want to know, are not quite the same defense. For more forgotten cases, famous mysteries, and dark history, consider subscribing. Until next time.